If it's not a high conviction decision, then you didn't even need to be there. Because you only need a high conviction decision when it's not obvious which way to go. Figure out which way to go. You probably don't even need a PM there. Wow. It should be fairly obvious, like, okay, keep optimizing this thing. The high conviction parts where it's like, it's very ambiguous. There's a big unknown about the future for all these various reasons, or there's just so many factors, it's like such a complex system. And so the two choices are analysis paralysis and inaction, or action. Those are the meta choices. And your job as a PM is to make sure that there's action.
Brendan, it's such a pleasure to have you on the CPO Mastery Podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Mo, for having me.
Awesome. I'd love to get started with the first question. So what has your journey been into product management? How did you get into product management, and what are you up to right now?
I went to school actually for like finance and capital markets and derivatives and whatnot. Went to University of Toronto, so I didn't have any view of getting into tech or anything when I graduated. So I went into industry there for about 3 or 4 years, and it was actually me kind of freaking out and thinking that, oh man, I don't want to like work in this structured finance world for the next 40 years. Because you can really see like how your career goes when you get into the firms and stuff. You can see that it's very structured. And that I kind of like had a very early like quarter life crisis saying, you know, there has to be more in life basically. And I always had a bit of an entrepreneurial bent, did a lot of side businesses when I was a kid. I used to play poker. I did like investing and stuff when I was a kid. So a friend of mine, also a classmate, we decided to start bootstrapping something on the side. Neither of us were technical, but we worked our day jobs and we like paid overseas developers and we were like moonlighting the development of something. The startup that we ended up founding was called Toonsy. It helped YouTube musicians monetize their fan bases. So this is back when like Justin Bieber got famous doing cover music, you know, through his webcam and stuff like that. So we're kind of capitalizing on that trend. We had no idea what we were doing as entrepreneurs or technologists really. And we kept bootstrapping, so we kept working and we joined a lot of pitch competitions. You know, something we were good at because of work is like building pitch decks. So we were able to like go into these competitions with no product, but like a really big vision about how we were going to transform the music industry through like user-generated content and YouTube and stuff like that. Luckily, we won our fair share of those competitions, and we ended up winning one where the judging panel was a bunch of angel investors. And that weekend, we actually closed like, this sounds like a very small amount now, but back then it was a lot. It was like $250,000. And we just quit our jobs on Monday and decided, again, we were like contracting overseas like development. So like we still didn't even have a functioning prototype of anything, and we still weren't technical, but we just quit our jobs and decided to have a run at being entrepreneurs. It's a very long story. So, you know, 3.5 years go by, we pivot a bajillion times. We hire, we fire, we raise a few bridge rounds. What ended up happening sort of between the two of us is my co-founder, Derek, who's now the CEO of a customer loyalty platform called Drop. He ended up working mostly around like sales, marketing, and finance, managing the investors, stuff like that. And I ended up working mostly with the developers and the designers. And so I didn't realize it at the time, but like, you know, a lot of what I was doing was product management. That's actually where my product management life started. I even learned, you know, how to do some pretty lightweight, but important for the long-term like code. So able to do some front end stuff and just sort of demystified a lot of what programming was for myself, which I think was very important. It also taught me importantly that like, even though you've gone through university and you're an adult now, you can still learn new things. Very long story short on that one, we had a soft landing. We sold to this company called SFX Entertainment, which bought the product to repurpose for like Coachella and Tomorrowland because they owned those properties. That company blew up in spectacular fashion a year after they bought us, but we were happy. You know, as first-time entrepreneurs, we had an outcome. Investors got a return. It was, you know, we didn't have anything life-changing at all, but it was such an amazing experience. So then from that, being pretty tired after that first startup experience, I wanted to get a job. And so I was thinking about what to do. I didn't really know, like, should I go back to finance now? Or like, what am I, kind of? And I basically learned that I was a product manager based on what I've been doing. And from some of the founders that I'd met, I ended up getting an opportunity to be a PM at a company in Toronto called FreshBooks, which was about a Series A company at the time. It helped SMBs do invoicing and accounting. and there were about like 60, 70 people. So that's the first time I was like a professional product manager. It's kind of funny. I still didn't really even know what it meant to do it from a professional standpoint. I was just an entrepreneur and getting whatever done that needed to be. But there, I was able to sort of learn the ropes of how to like be a bit more process oriented, framework minded, just have more rigor in the way that you develop a product. I was there for about 3.5 years. Rose the ranks there, ended up as a product director, launched a bunch of important products there, and had some great experiences. Still friends with many folks there, great company. That's when kind of through some of the other folks I'd met in the startup scene in Toronto, got a tap that Shopify, was a really, really interesting company that you should look at joining. There's a lot of fun stuff happening. It's about to IPO. I joined Shopify. It was an interesting scenario. Basically, they had not really formed a product management organization. So they had about 500 people at the time, and maybe only like 3 or 4 people with the word product in their title. It didn't even mean that they were actually product managers. It was just sort of like someone was like product operations or something like that. So one of the big reasons I was hired, and I learned after, so I ended up interviewing with Craig Miller, who was the CMO at the time, and eventually became the CPO. And then I actually ended up interviewing with Toby too, the CEO, which I thought actually was weird at the time. I was like, that's literally the most senior person like for hiring an individual contributor PM, because that's what they were interviewing me for. Even though so I kind of actually took a double title demotion to join Shopify because it was such an interesting company. One of my big mandates, I think, was to figure out how product should work at Shopify. I kind of only learned that like in my second day there, because I think it was a little bit too much of like tricky thing to say like, hey, come and be a product manager here when there's no sense of exactly what that means and whatnot. But I had already started like writing a little bit, and some of my thoughts were out there on the black box of product management stuff. And so so I joined that company, and we kind of went through this interesting experience where we would figure out the right method of product management, like the definition of the role within that company. And so at Shopify, it was very much an engineering and design-centric organization, to the extent that the content marketers on the blog, like they could only change or update a blog by like creating a pull request, or they had to deploy it themselves. Like there was no CMS or anything like that. Toby liked it that way. He's a pretty hardcore developer and engineer at heart. So I think that every good company reflects its founder. And so the thing we ended up figuring out was that Shopify's PMs were very much a strategic function. We are there to help teams build the right thing. The key 2 parts of that were you help the team. You're not like some mini CEO. You figure out what needs to be done for the benefit of the customer and the team. And like you have to be a chameleon and figure out how to fulfill those roles. You have to build the right thing. So like you are accountable for the right feature being built. And so like those are the 2 things that I think were really valuable to Shopify at that time. Really that accountability, that clear decision maker on like, this is the bet we're going to make and it's on me and here's why. Sort of that like servant leadership attitude around how you're supposed to interact with the teams, because we didn't want to come in and start dictating to engineering teams that had built everything Shopify was at the time, how things are done. Like you just don't have the authority to do that. Kind of from that alignment with Toby and the exec team, we started hiring. We started placing PMs on certain engineering teams. There might have been 50 engineering or project teams at that time, and we only had like 5 PMs. So it was like, not that we did 10 to 1, rather we just chose which ones would have a PM. And our goal sort of in the first 12 months was, will people ask for PMs at the end of the year? Because it was so clear what the difference was. And we wanted it to be success measured that way, as opposed to like some other contrived reason that we believe that we're useful. We'll be deemed useful when people say we're useful. And so luckily within 6 months, we had teams asking right away. I think like those first 6 months were very hard. Shopify was like a lot of showing up to teams and they're like, why are you here? Like literally, because they'd never worked with someone like that, and you don't design, you don't code. So they're just like literally shrugging about like, I don't know why you're in this meeting, but we're just going to continue having this meeting, right? And so you had to earn trust, like day in and day out. You had to show your value, do the littlest things and the big things. And I think like where we really started to show a lot of value was, it wouldn't be obvious at the time, but it ended up being alignment. I think like the way we were able to like pull multiple threads across the company and say like, well, this team's working on this is this, and like be able to find where there's conflicts, elevate those discussions to Toby and the exec team, and then say like, form basically working backwards from what everyone was doing, like a grander product strategy and clearer direction. And I think people on those teams, the engineers, the designers alike, started to recognize like when there's a PM on your team, there's just deeper alignment with like, frankly, Toby. and there's more momentum around your ideas, and it ultimately impacts the success of the project, success and the impact it has on customers. And I think that that's what everyone in that company wanted, right? It was quite altruistic, in the sense of like, we are there to really empower businesses to sell more online and be entrepreneurs. We took all that momentum. First year, we ended the year with like, I think 13 PMs. By the end of the second year, we had like 35. Today, it's like 450 or something like that. And so that, that whole arc was the first 3 years of my life there. Then the next 3 years were really around I'd been promoted to a director at that point, and then the company transformed into divisional structure, and I took over as GM of the developer platform. I became the GM of that, so I had more cross-functional reporting, not just PMs reporting into me, but engineers, designers, and stuff like that. And that was really in charge of growing that developer ecosystem and managing the App Store, the API, the business around that, data policy, all these types of things. And then the last 2 years I had at Shopify were basically just ending in December in 2022. But I took lead of our M&A and investments team, which is a completely different job entirely. And it was really just to use Shopify's capital in a way that's like purely strategic to the product. So the mandate was like, use our capital to accelerate the roadmap. And Toby, I think he's known for bets on people like this, which is just like, he bet that it's much easier to teach someone with deep product knowledge how to be a VC than the vice versa, for them to really have an intuition of Shopify's product, its people, and its culture. And so myself and also a peer of mine, Satish Kanwar, we both kind of walked into those roles. And we did like 20 investments, 9 acquisitions in the last 2 years. And then I hung up my shopping bag at the end of 2022 because I think after my first startup about 15 years ago, I think I'm ready to do another one. And so that's kind of why I left, is to start another company, which is, even Toby says on his first day, like in onboarding, the best way to leave Shopify is to go start a company. And so, it was, I kind of took that to heart. And now I'm just exploring a bunch of ideas and with that intent.
I know Derek in social media. I don't know him personally, but it's interesting that both you and Derek have gone on to have successful careers. I go back to your 3 years working on your first startup. What was unique about what you did, and what was the things that you learned? What's the magic sauce there?
That was a crazy time. We didn't know what we were doing. We didn't have any technical knowledge. We didn't know how to build a product. We didn't have any customers. We just had so I think the first lesson is like, don't build a business like that. Like don't start a business just based on your own kind of internal narrative of this amazing pitch and business you can build.
Really?
Crazily, and this happens still today, like we were able to raise money on that. We could pay to big vision. We could say like, the market's this size. We can show these design wireframes of how this product is gonna look. We can, have an initial customer list. And I don't mean this as it's fraudulent, but rather like we're networking with these musicians and they're like, yeah, I'll do that. That sounds cool. And we're like, okay, we got 3 musicians on, right? And it's like, you get these false senses of validation. You never really hit market. You never hit market until you burn through so much capital and you realize that like you didn't have a hypothesis built on like anything in the real world. And so, it's cliche now because there's so much startup knowledge. It's like, you got to get out to market fast because you need, like, your idea has to hit market reality as soon as possible in order for you to build confidence that it's something worth pursuing. What I would do completely differently, if I did that startup again, right, would be to get out in market a very, very simple prototype and start charging people and selling to people right away so that I could learn all the painful lessons we had at the beginning, instead of going into 12 months of building something, launching it, and then 7 people use it. And we went through that 3 times, like 3 versions of that exact same thing. Like, we would launch, fail. Okay, it didn't work. Here's 3 pieces of feedback. Like, literally 3 customers told us this feedback. And okay, now let's pivot the whole company this way. Build it for another 6 to 9 months. Launch. Same thing. We actually ended up getting to something that was like kind of interesting, but it was too little too late in a way. Like I mentioned, it was a soft landing as a company, and that was because we eventually, after like the 2nd or 3rd bridge round we tried to raise, we couldn't raise any more. The market wasn't big enough. If we, by the time we sold, if we had that version of the product in the first year, I think we could have built something really big. But it took us too long to get there because we we weren't aggressive enough into getting into market and basically learning from real customers in the real world, as opposed to staying in our own, hypothetical land of things that will work and narratives that sound good. It's a cliche lesson, I think, for startups. But as first-time founders, before, I think any of that knowledge was as obvious or ubiquitous, we learned that the hard way.
Yeah.
Basically. So that's what I take from it again and again and again, is just like, whatever your idea is, get to the root of would make that idea work or not. What's the key assumption there, or the key idea you have there? And then what is the absolute fastest way to validate that? And often you'll find picking up the phone and trying to cold call and sell someone is the fastest way. Don't build anything. Just like pretend that you have it, try to sell it, and then see if someone's like, okay, I'll buy that. That sounds great, or whatever, or some version of that. And you just didn't have to build anything, and you got that nugget of that data point, right? So,
is there any times that does not work?
Yes, I think in cases where it's such a new, novel thing to the world, where like there's no reference point. So you're trying to explain to this customer like it's going to do this and this and this, and they're like, they just can't understand it, right? Like explaining an iPhone before it existed or something like that is an easy metaphor for that, or analogy. And so there are cases where I think that you have to. I still don't think you actually have to build the whole thing, but you have to find the middle ground, or the shortest path to making it feel real. You can imagine before they could create the iPhone, like all the complexity that went into it, they could have validated the use for it by making like a fake kind of piece of hardware that didn't actually have any compute underneath. It just showed a screen and you could touch something, right? Like, that's still very hard, to be clear, but that's a far cry. If they really had to validate it, they could do something like that.
Where does brand fit into your thinking on products that are more expensive and validating that? And what I mean specifically is when you're selling something that's more expensive, that's 0 to 1, like maybe like how important do you think brand is in getting the sale, as opposed to just the functionality of it?
Like if you're selling more in like the luxury market, for example, or
any product that is expensive where brand would be important. Could be a tech product, B2B.
And is it from a scenario where you have no brand yet?
You have no brand, exactly.
Got it. So like, I guess the question is like, when you have no brand, but you're gonna sell in an upper market where brand is going to be important.
Yeah.
How much are you willing to tarnish that brand?
Exactly. Or how do you launch there? Is there any way to go lean on that? Or do some products just require you to build up brand?
Well, I think it's hard to just build a pure brand. I think the brand is always an outcome of everything else that you do. Right? So it's high quality product or service or whatever it may be, then you develop a brand around that reputation. If you're going very high end, where the expectation from potential customers is going to be very high, I think you do have to take some more care. Right? But at the same time, you've seen companies try these things where a different way to look at it is high end. A lot of high end is status and exclusivity. So we've certainly seen products out there that play on that psychology before it's even built. So think of something like Superhuman email. Like back in the day, before people were using it, like how hard was it to get an invite to this thing?
Right.
Sign up for this waiting list, share it to 10 people, you go up the waiting list or whatever. Was it Dropbox was the first one to do that marketing technique? Anyway, whatever. You see what I'm getting at though?
Yeah.
It's like you can position yourself and the product in this sphere by just like directly marketing to that psychology status. And by directly marketing to that psychology, you're going to be able to validate things about the product itself, because you can't just market like, sign up here to be high status. It's like, no, use this thing and only, certain high status people are going to be able to use it. Yeah. Then you can start to validate it.
So you can still go lean there. I love that. And next section is really around 0 to 1 products that Shopify's launch have been so successful at. They've had incredible success with the developer platform, Shopify Plus. Is there anything that has been the ingredients to consistently launching these successful products?
At Shopify?
Yeah.
Well, I think the things we remember, especially from the outside, that are successful is a very small proportion of all things that are ever built. So that's like the immediate answer. There were so many things that never made it to launch, never made it past build, like even like the prototyping stage, that launched and we don't even remember their names and they just died. Those far outweigh the things that we remember.
Got it.
So it's like survivorship bias.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. And that was my next question on, I think Shopify has a unique approach on thinking about sunk costs. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Why do you think that it has a unique approach?
I think most companies attach too much emphasis on continuing a project that hasn't been continued. And Shopify doesn't always do that, which is a good thing. So they don't care much about sunk costs. I want your opinion on that.
I think that's
and
true.
Some examples.
I think that's true. I think it all comes down to to Toby. Toby is an incredibly high conviction individual. He tries to build a culture that can look at itself and say like, we are working on the most important thing right now, and not have to deal with the social, or sorry, not deal with, but is strong enough to like have the conversations to fight through the social consequences of that, the political consequences of that. So a lot of it comes from his own conviction of sort of the issues that companies get, and especially when they get larger, that prevent them from having that level of conviction. This is May 13th that we're talking now. So fresh off the press 2 weeks ago or a week ago, Shopify divested its logistics business, right? And there was a series of layoffs related, lots of great people got let go at Shopify. Let's focus on the logistics part.
Yeah.
4 or 5 years ago, we had our Unite conference and we got up on stage and said, this is the future of Shopify. We're getting into logistics. We're going to put billions of dollars into it. And we did, culminating, and we bought Deliver for $2 billion last year. That's sunk cost. Thousands of people in this business. Now, I'm not in the company anymore, so I can't understand exactly, all the reasons that went into the decision. But it's certainly an example of not getting stuck by sunk cost. What you read from the public statements from Toby's own internal email that they shared publicly is sort of, this is not core to our mission anymore. It's not the most, it is an important thing, but it's not the most important thing. This will allow us to focus. There's a lot happening in our core business, especially around innovation in AI and whatnot, that is requiring our even deeper commitment and focus. And therefore, yes, I know we got up on stage and said this, and the investor community thinks, built all their models with the assumption that we're going to do this and this and this and the logistics, and it's going to create this revenue and all these other factors, right? And all the people that we love working with and that we build relationships, but this is the most important thing. And so therefore we're doing that, right? And so he leads by example. That kind of propagates through the organization as a cultural thing. And that's the only way I think it can start. In any company, like culture, it's the CEO down.
I see this happening across a lot of firms. Google shutting off Area 120, Shopify going back to the core. I wonder what happens to the take 10% crazy bets. What's happening to that aspect?
I think it's on pause. I think
Is this the first time that's happening?
That it's on pause?
At this big level?
In my career, yes. I think there was a dark period after like the great financial recession.
Yeah.
It's an austerity thing. There's like, when the economy is perceived to be heading to contraction, interest rates are high, the multiples are down on tech. Like, it's harder to raise capital now. Like back in the heyday, kid you not, Shopify could decide right now, we should raise $1 billion. And the money would be in our bank account in 24 hours. Because there was so much capital out there, so much investor appetite. Just call the bankers and they'll get that deal done.
Yeah.
Right? Like we had so many cases where we would make an announcement to the market, we're raising equity capital. And usually when they do that, they're announcing that first thing, and then subsequently they announce the closing of that at a price or whatever, they found an investor. We would announce it at the same time. We've decided to raise equity capital and it's all sold, right? Kind of thing. And so like that whole world is gone.
Yeah.
Right? And that wasn't long ago. And that world created, the beginning of 10% or 20, it used to be 20% time, I believe, and then became 10%. Like that world of excess, and like you didn't need to actually, because capital was free, you didn't need to be as efficient. It actually, logically, when capital is free, you should make as many bets as possible because there's almost no cost to making more bets, right? When capital isn't free, now you have to actually run the ROI on every bet, and then you have constraints on your resources. And so that's why these things are paused, getting cut off and stuff like that. It's actually, I think it's a natural function of capitalism. When the tide turns the other way again, it'll start the other direction, and it'll probably get to, start in moderation and then become excess again. And this is probably going to be true this way too. It's like, it's going to contract and it's going to be moderate shutdowns, and then it's going to be stupid shutdowns. Like there'll be companies that are cutting off parts of their businesses that they shouldn't because they're so afraid of overspending or whatever that they lose their will or vision of how to build a longer term business. They start sacrificing the long term for the short term in a contractionary environment. So it's going to happen, I think, both ways. Like that's how all boom and bust cycles tend to go.
You talk about Toby having conviction. I've heard you say it too. Where does high conviction come from?
I think it comes from a deep belief that the right direction of things, like what's going to happen. and the way that your company, yourself, you need to act. So like you have to have that deep belief. How you build that, everyone's different. Some people, they can build that just in their head. I know how everything is going to play out. We're going all in here. That's it. There's other people that they spend time learning about something until they really feel like they understand it. They have a healthy self-skepticism and they know they don't know everything. So they talk to people that know those things, they learn themselves, and then they make that. But ultimately it comes down to that same thing. It's like my belief, I've passed that line where like I would bet the farm that this thing is going to happen. Now, when you know that that's true, you have to marry that with, is there something I care about enough that where this thing I know is going to happen is going to affect it if I don't do something, right? Like the world's going this way with AI. I love Shopify so much as a company. I'm just pretending to be Toby here, that I know that we have to go that way or else we might not exist in 10 years, right? And then you marry that with, okay, we have a constrained environment. Okay, we have to let go of legit. Again, I'm not in the company. I made all this up. So that's where I think it comes from, is you have to care about enough something and you have to have a view of the future that requires you to create some action. Toby, I will say from my vantage point, and this is definitely something I think that propagated throughout the culture in Shopify, like he definitely is not someone that just shoots from the hip on his judgment. Like I promise you, if he believes AI is big, he has using everything that exists in the AI world. And this is one of his superpowers of just like being able to be a fast learner, but also being very technical. He doesn't take anything at surface level, right? Like he will go in there and actually see, oh, the tides are changing in this technology. Oh, you can actually do these things, right? And he will inform his strategic direction on like hardcore engineering truths, basically, and marry that with like his own mission to grow entrepreneurship through Shopify, and that's where a lot of those high conviction bets come.
How important are high conviction decisions for product managers?
I'd say they're probably the essential part of the job. If it's not a high conviction decision, then you didn't even need to be there, because you only need a high conviction decision when it's not obvious which way to go, right? If you could figure out which way to go sort of methodically through data or whatever, you probably don't even need a PM there.
Wow.
It should be fairly obvious, like, okay, keep optimizing this thing or whatever. The high conviction parts where it's like, it's very ambiguous. There's a big unknown about the future for all these various reasons, or there's just so many factors. It's like such a complex system. And so the two choices are analysis paralysis and inaction or action. Those are the meta choices. And your job as a PM is to make sure that there's action, because definitely the latter, the inaction and the analysis paralysis, is not going to create any good outcome. And so I think especially, you and I have been talking about AI a lot today, especially with like a lot of the documentation, communication, alignment type of work, potentially getting like, 10x in efficiency, 100x in efficiency with AI. I think this is what the job is going to come down to. It's going to be conviction. It's like that's what the product job comes down to, because ultimately, like they always say, one of the big weaknesses in AI is that it can't create its own objective function. Like it doesn't have a will about what it needs to be. Now you could tell it, make the choice that makes Shopify grow the fastest or whatever. But if it's obvious enough to do that, again, like that's not a high conviction call. It's when there's like it could go, it's 50-50 this way or this way, or 33, 33, 33, if there's three options, that I think that's when the PM has to come in, or anyone, a human really, has to come in and make that decision about how to act.
From your past experience, what percentage of decisions are high conviction decisions, and does it change by level from associate product manager to VP?
Oh yeah, it changes drastically. I'd say like when you're a more entry level PM, I don't know, maybe a disruptive statement, but I think like a lot of the decisions you make actually could be done by an AI at the very entry level, because a lot of it is like decisions about roadmap or backlog sequencing. So if you have a project and you have all these tasks and it's backlog sequencing and you're working through the engineers, like you're basically just running an ROI function. It's like, what sequence do we do these things that most efficiently finish the thing or do it with the least amount of risk? That is actually procedural. Now, your job as a PM is you're actually like asking the right questions to be able to get to make quantitative what is otherwise qualitative. Like an engineer, if it's like a difficult engineering problem, let's say, you sometimes are in the room helping engineers facilitate a discussion around it, be like, does this feel like a medium t-shirt or a large t-shirt? Like all those types of things, right? Yeah. You're just facilitating, trying to make this like gray area into something quantitative. But then ultimately, once you get all those, those 10 tasks and you figure out the R, the return and the investment and the effort on each of them, you're just sorting. You're just sorting about whatever's the highest ROI, and then you're doing them 1 to 10, right? So I think and that is a lot of what entry-level PM is. I think a lot of that is, I don't know if it's gonna go away, But I think a lot of that will go a lot faster. And it'll be a lot less of the time that a PM spends. Much more important will be figuring out what people want, right? I think an AI can optimize on something that people already have that we know they want.
Yeah.
But to figure out the next thing that they want, it's probably still a ways away. So I think PMs still have a big role to play there. But back to your original question, as you go up in seniority, basically your whole day should be filled with tiebreaker questions. Like I remember when I was VP product and the GM, like basically the whole day, every single meeting is the teams booking a meeting with you because after 6-7 weeks of debate, experimentation, they cannot agree to go this way or this way. And you're there to break the tie. Like that's the entire job, actually.
That feels exhausting as a VP when you're making the most difficult decisions that teams have been struggling for 6 weeks, and that's your job, 9 to 5. Feel like, wouldn't you lack confidence, or how do you know? Seems like a lot to face.
Yeah, I think you recognize that is your job. That's the job you're paid to do. I think if you make it to such a level, like you're getting compensated well, like you should be in the hot seat. So that's a responsibility you should be pretty well aware of. Is it draining? Yes, but I think like you toughen up over time. Like you just get used to that. I also think that you have a different vantage point because you get to see the set of all tiebreaker problems, and you get to see like this is not really that big of a deal when we're also thinking about this other thing. Like if this thing goes wrong, these 10 other projects don't even matter. And so that's why it doesn't agonize as much, because you may get 10 decisions of that. It might be their most important thing, but since you get to see them all, you realize these are all fairly small. So I can make a quick decision, and the risk of failure of that decision, if the one that I made was wrong, we can absorb that as a company and as a group. And then the one or two that you realize like, oh, like these ones could have a big impact. Those are the ones that you yourself end up escalating. Like I'm bringing that to the CEO because I believe that it's that important that I need more feedback on this, right? So it's kind of like half the job is sorting too between those two types.
So you've got 2 senior product managers. Is there a correlation between the one senior product manager that makes more high conviction decisions as opposed to the other? Is it a prerequisite to accelerate in your career to make more high conviction decisions?
Yes.
But be right about them?
So it's high risk, high reward, right? People can come in guns blazing and say this. If they're wrong too many times in a row, they lose trust and respect in the organization, and their feet are cut off from under them. It's very hard to recover from that, frankly. You do have to be right more than wrong. I think that is just generally true. That's just true of any leadership role anywhere. Like take any random tribe of human beings and put the leaders in there, and the one that keeps being right is just gonna get more trust.
Yeah.
And there's no difference in this world.
I find many senior product managers are so good at execution, but they get stuck at the more strategic level. And they want to be able to take more strategic decisions, or they want to think more, they want to make more of those high conviction decisions. But I think it seems like a glass door. What advice do you have for folks like that? As you just said, you have to make more high conviction decisions and be right about them. How do you do that?
Well, you have to be invited to the decision-making table. That's the prerequisite for all of it.
Yeah.
Is why am I not at that table? Because almost by definition, if they're not making the strategic decisions, they're not at that table.
Yeah.
And it's because the decision makers that are currently making that decision don't feel that their input is required to make the right decision there, right? And so are they right about that? And if so, then you have to think about, I wouldn't say like how to get into that table. I think that's like a weird political way to think about it, but rather what could you be doing internally, externally with customers, et cetera, to give yourself the right context so that you do have an opinion that is important for that table. Like if no one's paying attention frontline to the customer, and you know that the decisions are being made without that view, you can position yourself with that context to be useful. Figure out what context at that table is missing and how for you to get it to be the one that gets invited to it to help that, right? I always think like that's the right way to apply to think about these things, because if you try to force it in through politics, saying like, hey, I want to be part of that meeting, I think it should be my job to make that decision or whatever, you're just playing a relationship game. I don't think you're not thinking about the function of the role or how good decisions get made in like the right way, which is like what information is required to make this decision the right way. Now, I will admit, especially in large companies, there are a lot of politics at play. So you might be the right person, but they might be cutting you out of that. Others might be cutting you out of that table for whatever reason. You have to recognize that that's the case. And like that's a different bit of advice I'd give, which is like, if you recognize you're in a trap like that, you got to find another table to join. Like go to a different team, go to a different company. Like for whatever reason, if you're politically outcasted from that group and that's like creating a ceiling for you, then accept that that's what it is, and stop banging your head against the wall, because it's not about how good you are at your job or how strategic you are. It's that there's this other human social game happening that's preventing you from even having a voice. Now, okay, so that's like the very first thing. I don't even know if that's the answer to your question. Say you are at that table and you don't have a strong strategic voice yet, right? You're mostly just like part of the consensus.
Yeah.
Do you actually agree with everything that's being said? That's the first thing you challenge yourself on. If you actually think like what's being tabled and then agreed on and then executed is actually exactly what you would do, nothing to change. Because why do you want strategic? Basically, you do have strategic power because everything you think should happen is happening. So really, it should only grind your gears when you have a different view of what should be happening, but it's not happening and you don't have a voice or it's not being heard. I think a lot of that comes down to people, being risk adverse. You got to put yourself out there. You got to put, even if there's, 9 people in the room and you have to be the 10th that says, I think that's actually wrong. It takes a lot of conviction and a little bit of career risk sometimes, but then high risk, high reward too.
Yeah.
Right? So many people, there's a lot of really senior people at Shopify who have earned long-term respect because they have proven that they are independent thinkers. If they don't agree, despite all the social dynamics in a room, they will say they don't agree. As a leader, I'm looking for people like that too, because you definitely, every leader's also been in rooms where people will just agree with whatever they say.
Yeah.
And that's not helpful. Not for the pursuit of the truth or the right answer or whatever it may be. So it's either going to be those two things. You're not at the table for some reason, just tackle that. And then if you're at the table, either you agree with what's going on and everything's good, or you're afraid to say it.
Yeah. This last question on decision making is on intuition.
Okay.
If you look at your own decisions, those big bets that were successful, I wonder if you can quantify if more of them came from intuition or more of them came from having data. Maybe I can help qualify this. If you made a gut decision somewhat quickly, potentially it's more intuition based versus doing a long data analysis.
I would actually characterize it differently. I would say every decision I ever have made is intuition, and there's varying levels of data informed or otherwise informed I have been for each of those things. And so you never get to a place where the data is so clear that this is the obvious decision, or else it would already be made. And so every decision is made on intuition. And it's about right-sizing the kind of risk you're willing to take on that intuition with the risk of a bad decision. The most important element of any decision is or a bunch of decisions is knowing which one's the most important and why. What's the risk of the wrong decision here? What I'd like to think is that I was able to recognize over the course of my career which decisions were actually high risk. And for those, I would try to leave nothing unturned. What's every bit of information we can get to de-risk the situation? I tried to go as far into that as possible, and delay it as long as possible until we can make the right decision, unless there was some other external time factor. So, I wouldn't say I use more than one or the other. I want to say I strive to use the appropriate amount of diligence, basically, for relative to risk, if that makes any sense.
No, it's helpful. Thank you for that. Next question is on product-led growth. What's your perspective on product-led growth? Can you share insights on when teams should think about implementing it?
Could you, just so I'm clear, what do you mean by product-led growth?
What I mean by product-led growth is the primary strategy where the way that the product is sold is through the product showing benefits as opposed to a sales team selling it or marketing selling it.
I think it depends on what type of product and market it's in. If you're an enterprise, you do need the marketing and sales team because it's very complex sales cycles, et cetera. Okay, so let's call that the answer, obviously, for that one.
Yeah.
But from, let's say, a more self-serve productized type of product, I think you have to lean on it as much as possible. It's the thing that it's a salesperson that never sleeps, that experience, and it's the thing that scales, and it's most cost efficient as a business to be able to do it. I think you should always push yourself to say, why would I ever need it? Why do I have to interject as a human being, whether it's salesperson or account management or whatever it may be? Every time I have to intervene is it suggests as a failure in the experience of the product. At least should be your intuition until proven otherwise. Why did I have to give them this context that, oh, don't worry, this is just helping you through this part of onboarding so that you can get your payments set up or something why didn't we just say that in the product? Why did we have to design it in a way where that's not clear? And I think that that's a much healthier mindset and aspiration than, just relying on more people.
I love those analogies that you said. The salesperson that never sleeps.
Totally.
Right? And it's the most cost-effective way of doing it. All right, awesome. Next set of questions on a very hot topic, which is top of mind for many, many PNs. Given the emergence of AI and generative AI, how should product managers think about this in terms of their roadmap?
Ooh, in terms of their roadmap.
Yes, in terms of their product roadmap. We'll get to career a little bit later.
I think it matters so much what they're working on, what space they're working on.
Okay.
I think these especially these LLMs, these large language models, they're able to do sort of like a lot of very broad, so that's very interesting. Like they could do a lot of work that's very broad, but it's a lot of work that is sort of, if you get to the root of it, quite procedural and manual in a way. Like, I know we're talking about the products that they're building, but let's even just use their own jobs as an example.
Yeah.
It's like, as a PM, like writing a requirements doc or something like that. Like, you could bullet out the requirements a lot faster than you can write a product spec. But you write the product spec because it's a better read. There may be people who are less in tune with like how a PM thinks or whatnot that need a larger, like a more descriptive version of that thing, right? So you'd spend a lot of time as a PM like writing out something so it's more appropriately understood. And I think of the LLMs as a lot of this sort of like translation layer between things. It can take something, a real raw thought, and make it into a format that's digestible by a larger group, for example, right? And today that's what PMs do as a job. Both ways, also ingesting these really large documents and like figuring out the 5 bullet points that matter from that thing. If your product if the users of your product do work like that, whether in your product or in the industry then they're in around your product, that's opportunity for AI. So like, I don't know, if you're working, very straightforward example, if you're working on a product that helps get signatures for documents for lawyers, how much work do lawyers do that is like crazy repetitive and looking up like precedent, for example, and like creating lots of like footnotes and relating things to like other documents and cases and all these types of things. Like AI can do a lot. You can envision AI doing a lot of it. Now, I think the tricky part of where AI is that like you take any piece of writing where you're a real expert in and you're like, this is pretty good, but like I wouldn't trust this, right? There's like, it's like 98% there or something, but like there's a little bit of probabilistic uncertainty. Like, these AI hallucinations, like we'll say, like you're just not sure if it's always gonna be right. And there are some industries where like you have to be right,
yeah,
or you get sued,
yeah.
right? And so I think that's where technology is. So I think it's a great time to start prototyping and figuring out where AI could add the most leverage to solve your customers' problems. And then only through prototyping and also a little bit of patience, I think you find out if that actually will work. Because the other thing that's really interesting in AI right now, I think, is that the rate of change is so fast that you almost have to build with an assumption of how much better everything's going to get. Like, is every 6 months and every like dot version of GPT going to eventually become like alien level intelligence or something like that? Like, that's the part that I think is really interesting. But today, pragmatic use, I think it comes down to like the types of work that people do where perfection isn't required or 100% accuracy isn't required or good enough is good enough. And so that's why a lot of this is like exploding in like marketing copy use cases. Like, you write some ad and send it out. Okay, it wasn't perfect, but did it still get 70 clicks instead of, if you wrote it perfectly yourself, 72 clicks? But the AI one you did instantaneously and did 1,000 reps of them in 5 seconds, do that. Right? So this interesting, like, you have to find the right sweet spot between like where the quality of the bar is acceptable, knowing that there's going to be an error rate. And if there's a failure, it's no big deal, right? So kind of like low severity type of pieces of work, basically. And the other, so that's one side. I actually think like the internal use is a lot more interesting right now. Like the decision-making use, the knowledge workers inside of the organization, how they can do it, because they're already working with imperfect information, right? Like, someone writes a whole, let's say thesis or doc about this is what we should do as a company and strategy. Like, it's already imperfect. It's just an idea, right? But the way that AI can actually help someone flesh out that idea, make it shareable and ready, and then vice versa, help someone receive that idea and then distill it into something really small in a summary so that there's higher efficiency of communication, basically. That's amazing, because if someone shares you a product strategy idea, like you both don't know if it's right. It's just a conversation. You're just sharing an idea, and then you actually have a conversation around it, and then you make a conviction call, right? And so I think like internally that speeds up those processes of getting to the point where we know, like, we've been able to like basically have like a neural link together to share that idea and debate it as fast as possible so that we can say like, okay, now with our combined context, we should do this. It's taking that process, which may take weeks now, and making it into a day in my mind. I think that's what it's capable of, like almost already. Like we talked with the class that we had earlier today about that idea of like, imagine there's some project, there's, a finance team that's talking about project X, there's the marketing team that's talking about the launch of project X, there's the engineering team talking about engineering hurdles around project X, the product and design team thinking about some experiences about project X. They all have their independent meetings. And if an AI was transcribing those meetings and summarizing them, and it has knowledge of all 4 meetings, it can already know where there's misalignment between those teams, right? It's like, oh, the marketing team thought it was launching this day, but engineering's planning for it to launch on that day, right? And so without people even meeting, this company's underlying AI infrastructure can prompt back to the stakeholders that there is misalignment without there even needing to be a meeting. That's crazy, right? How much time does that save from organizational waste, especially in large companies? It's gotta be like it's an absurd number to say, but I honestly think it's like 70-80% of time and effort in big companies is misalignment and realignment. Like it has to be, especially when you're like launching a small set of features or set of products. Like you take Apple's cases, how many product lines they have? I don't know, 6 to 8 or something like that, plus a lot of software stuff, hundreds of thousands, maybe even people. I don't even know the exact count. How many meetings does it take to get all those people perfectly aligned, right? But that's the bulk of work. And it's that destructive, crazy creative process that happens around that leads to these amazing products. But if you take away all that overhead of just like law of large numbers around like number of meetings and miscommunication and all those types of things, because there's this ever-present AI that's just able to take like the gist of what you're talking about and be able to just like notify people when 2 people are talking about the same thing, but completely different directions. That's, I think, incredibly powerful.
Huge.
Especially for like senior leadership and whatnot. Sorry, we went all over the place.
Yeah.
This we can go forever on these. I think it's like, the other side that fascinates me is like, we've been talking a lot of like current PMs in companies and larger companies. I think new company formation over the next few years with this level of AI capability is going to be super interesting. Like, how many people do you need to hire anymore? Can a PM do a job of 5 PMs? 5 years from now, like, can a PM do a job of 5 PM? I think it's conceivable. If like backlog grooming, spec writing, wireframes, all these types of things are now like much closer to whatever is in the PM's brain. It just immediately just becomes a document or immediately becomes some sort of communication content form. That is like 80% of the actual work, right? Yeah. How many times you had a PM, like you have this idea, you need to make this pitch or whatever, and you have to write like this 10-page deck, or you're working with the designer to like bring this idea to a little bit more fidelity. So you're working on a wireframe, it takes a whole week to then take the wireframe and then bring it and present it to like this product director and their design director to see what they think of this idea, because that's the best way to communicate the idea. If you could just prompt that thing, like make a wireframe that does this, this, and this, and this, and this, and it happens in 5 seconds, like that's crazy for effectiveness. And so I think the scary part is that, will that lead to a lot more downsizing in larger companies? Maybe over the long term, or maybe they just hold flat for a very long time until like they've basically grown into that efficiency, productivity curve. And then newer companies, can they start to outcompete because they're way more capital efficient now, right? It's like even engineering too. Like how many amazing engineering stories have we seen of like developers who are, they say like 2 to 3 times more efficient now with the current tooling, not having to write low-level boilerplate code and, being able to, or data scientists using code interpreter to like create. Yeah. Well, actually, it's not even them. Like you could use it as a non-data scientist, right? It's just like, it's crazy to think like what a semi-technical solo founder might be able to do by themselves just with AI helping them. And I think that just is going to go to a place that it's hard to even fathom. But super interesting though. Yeah. It's also kind of humbling as a human, because it's also like, man, what did we really do? If the AIs figured out how to do so much of what we used to do, it's like, what did we even do? It's a really strange thought. It's like, is so much of what we did just so procedural and predictable? Certain scale, I guess, yeah. Take 100,000 PMs, like how many different versions of PM is there? Is that sombering? I don't know. Yeah, it's weird. It's weird to think of it. It's like, it's both energizing and sombering at the same time, yeah.
You mentioned something earlier. I wonder if you can talk about that again in our class. How should product managers who don't want to be disruptive think about AI in their companies?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I said this in class. I think like you should be that PM that leans into it, like definitely don't be, the Luddite around AI. Figure out how it can supercharge you and your teams, and B, position yourself as the person that is helping the company not use AI. I actually think that's the wrong lens, right? It's more like, oh, like, we use that alignment example. It's like how our company is way more aligned than it ever used to be because we've like used this tooling, and now we have this system that's telling us when we're misaligned passively, right? Like you're essentially solving the same problems you always used to do as a PM, but now you have a different set of tools to be able to do that. And I think it should be quite liberating too, because I don't know many PMs that would say like chasing down all these different cross-functional teams to find out if they're actually aligned with you and realizing they never are, and then having to course correct all of that, like, is fun. Most PMs never sign up for that job, because they're good at that.
Yeah.
It's much more around like they love customers, they love building and designing products, they love working with engineering teams. And I think you get to do more of that. Lean into what's capable and think of it as a way for you to do less of the things that are just busy work or, herding cats and people chasing and stuff like that. And you know why it feels like busy work? It's because it's not a creative act. Like booking meetings with 5 cross-functional teams and then figuring out if they're aligned with you or not is not a creative act. It's herding cats. And so, think of AI as a thing that could liberate you from that.
Just can't imagine like a PM role where you're like 70% of activities you do are done by AI. And what are you going to do? You're just going to be way more productive, but that would be really interesting.
I think you spend way more time with customers. Like how many PMs, especially when they get really super busy or super senior, like they never spend time with the customer anymore.
Yes.
That's like a natural thing for many, to the point where even in Shopify, like we had to build programs around staying in the front line with customers, where like I'd make sure I jump on support calls once a week or have a conversation with a developer, at least once a week. And I'd have to schedule these things in, and we made everyone do it. It's like a cultural push and all these types of things. It's not because we don't like that. Actually, every time we did it, we remind ourselves like how much that's the point of the job, but it's just because there's so much other crap. There's so much overhead to do, making 10,000, 1,000, 5,000, 30 people move in the same direction. So I think it will naturally just be filled with the things that are actually good about the job. Ideate with the team, prototype with the team, get it in front of customers, take that feedback and do rinse and repeat, do A. Like that's the fun part of PM.
Yeah.
It's that cycle. Ideate, we think we figured out a cool thing, show it to customers. If they love it, you get even more energized, but there's always feedback, and you keep doing it, and you eventually launch it, and they use it, and they love it, and that feeling's amazing. And if you only do that, like, it's the best job in the world.
Moving on to our last set of questions around PM career. So we have a lot of senior product managers that have an eye to one day be CPOs. What's the one true north focus they should keep in mind if they want to advance their career in the next 5 years, taking a more long-term approach?
I'd say like any very senior type role, it's important you have sort of the craft technical PM skills. I don't mean technical as like an engineering, but just like, the hardcore PM skills like backlog management, scope writing, all these types of things. It's important you have those experiences, but none of that matters in very senior roles. Very senior roles is relationship building, communication, leadership, being able to motivate people, being able to hire really good people, being able to make high conviction decisions, being able to say no a lot, being able to manage the board, manage a CEO. It's like for all those things I just mentioned, like you got to be a good salesperson. Every high level job is selling them at some level. Persuasion, we'll call it that, right? Not selling, persuasion. So if you want to ready yourself for those things, like you got to give yourself experiences to get good at that, right? If you've been in a very technically or execution focused product management path, which has, some elements of, leadership and communication, but not, it's not the majority of what you've done, I think you'll struggle. You'll struggle to even get that job because, the CEO that's going to hire you, they're not going to be looking for your technical execution skills or whatever. They're going to be looking for like, is this someone that like I can have a 1 hour high fidelity conversation with, and then they can just like motivate 300 people to go do this thing, and I never have to talk to them again for 6 months or whatever, right? Like that level of trust and experience, like to put that much trust in someone, you really have to believe that, they have that right stuff, and it's going to be really well-rounded. Like, can I envision them motivating people? Do they have good judgment? Will they be able to challenge me on things? Can they think strategically outside of just like product box that they've been in? Can they understand that, hey, we need to hit our target or else we can't raise money, right? Can they handle dealing with layoffs and all these types of things? Like it's I think any senior role, like that's a lot of what your actual day-to-day peer level decision-making is. And it's far less the actual function you're running because you're the head of that function. So no one really around the table is gonna challenge you on anything to do with that function, they just assume that you're going to do that well. And you should, but they're going to look at it more of just like black and white outcomes. It's like, did the product ship and is it good? If it's good, okay, that's what we expected you to do. If it's not, then you're not good. Goodbye, right? Like that's kind of the way it works in really executive roles. And that's why you see like when execs negotiate their contract, when they come in, their contracts, there's more C-level hires is more like contracts than they are like, here's a full-time offer for a job. Here's like a 3-year contract. And in that contract, people are negotiating their terminations already. They're like, if you fire me, I get 2 years of, because it's a very, make or break type of role, right? So realize that that's the reality of it, and then putting yourself in situations to get those experiences so that you can handle that and be good at them. But then also someone could look at you and say that this is someone that's more than just a PM, right? They are actually just like a general leader and able to run, manage a large company. To get those experiences, like sometimes you just gotta leave that career for a second and take a different, for me, one of the transformational roles in my career was becoming that GM from a product person. Cause now I had 150 engineers reporting into me, not directly, but indirectly, and designers. And I had to show and learn how to motivate those cross-functional teams. And that was to be clear, I got very lucky to be offered that gig, but I think without that gig, I wouldn't even be able to describe to you everything I just did about what executive leadership is and what the difference is. So it's a trick. I think it's a tricky part of anyone's career to position themselves to be that. You sometimes have to find and take some risk career role wise to do that. You may need to move to a different company and say hey, I want you to take this shot on me to be able to have a broader leadership role. You may want to look into some GM or more business operating side roles and maybe even start a company. I don't know. There's lots of different ways to tackle it, but I think there's a reason why a lot of executive roles are always brought out from external. That's pretty classic in most large companies. I'd say I don't know the exact statistics, but my intuition says it's 1/3 of executive roles are from inside at any given time, and then the other 2/3 are hired in from XYZ because they've already proven they can do it somewhere else. Why is someone going to take the risk?
So Brendan, for the very last question, these are tough times for a lot of people. Many folks have been affected by layoffs. As people are considering their next move, what do you think are the most important factors someone should think about when they're picking between different opportunities?
Is it a growing industry or a contracting one? No, I think that's one of the things they need to think about. I always think that everyone owes it to themselves to have a worldview of what parts of the world are going to contract and what parts are going to grow in terms of industry or whatever it may be. So if you could land a PM job at OpenAI, you're going to be employed for a while, even if OpenAI doesn't work out in a couple of years, because you just know there's so much job creation and demand in that industry, right? So go to where the energy is, go to where it's obviously going to sustain itself for quite a while. One thing. The opposite being if it's for sure going to decline somewhere, that's a scary place to be. If you're going to go PM the digital arm of a print newspaper, that's a scary place to be from a security standpoint. So to me, that actually trumps almost everything. Being right industry, right market is always rising tide lifts all boats. That's the key to life, basically.
Nice.
Right?
I love that.
But that aside, I think from a skills perspective, going back to that same fictitious PM about how to think about disruption about their own job with AI, I don't want to harp too much on AI, but whatever the skills are for your type of role, wherever they're moving towards, you got to be on the forefront. Don't be shy about those things. Be on the forefront of those things. Experiment with them. People want to. It'll actually allow you to distinguish yourself through interview cycles as well as someone that understands the new stack of working. Because sometimes people may want to just hire you to literally be an example so that everyone else levels up the way that they work. There's lots of ways to differentiate yourself and create value in the company per prospective PM. So yeah, and I don't know about you, but I've never gotten a job applying somewhere.
Yeah.
It's you have to always just work on your network. I know it's really painful. I don't love networking as a thing, but it is the way the world works. Access to opportunities, they come through trust and respect of people in a network with you. And so, just keep meeting people. Don't be transactional, because I think people can feel and see right through those things. But meet people with earnest curiosity, because that's just fun anyway.
Yeah.
And then find ways to help people, and then just believe in karma, basically. I think that's a very Valley answer, I think. I'm not from the Valley, to be clear, but I actually believe that's the right approach.
Brendan, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you for coming down to our campus here in San Francisco. It's been great to have you come in from Toronto. I know you're flying out. It's such a treat to have you this conversation, especially around decision making and the impact of AI, is at the forefront of what product managers have on their mind. And I know I found it very valuable, and I know the PMs that are listening are going to find it really valuable too. So thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks so much.